Keir Starmer has been humiliated today.
It was supposed to be just another routine session in Parliament. Another round of Prime Minister's questions. Another exchange of rehearsed lines, political jabs and predictable applause. But within minutes, the atmosphere inside Westminster shifted. Because this time, the questions weren't just about policy. They were about trust. They were about leadership. And they were about whether the man at the top was actually in control. At the centre of it all stood Prime Minister Keir Starmer, calm, composed and facing mounting pressure. Across the chamber, Opposition leader Kemi Badenoch rose to her feet, ready to strike. What followed wasn't just a political exchange. It was a clash of narratives about the future of the country and the stability of the government itself. Badenoch's line of attack was simple but effective. She focused on the growing controversies surrounding Starmer's team. Staff resignations, questionable appointments and whispers of internal chaos. Her argument was clear. How could the Prime Minister claim to be restoring stability to the country if he couldn't even maintain stability inside his own office? It was a sharp, targeted blow. Because leadership in politics is often judged less by speeches and more by the people you surround yourself with. And every resignation, every controversy, every awkward headline chips away at the image of control. Badenoch leaned into that narrative. She framed the issue not as a minor internal problem, but as a symbol of a government losing its grip. A Prime Minister promising order, yet facing turmoil behind the scenes. The implication was obvious. If he couldn't manage his own team, how could he manage the country? But Starmer wasn't about to let that argument go unanswered. When he rose to speak, his response wasn't just defensive. It was strategic. Instead of getting pulled into a back and forth over staff drama, he shifted the focus entirely. He pointed to the record of previous Conservative governments. Economic turbulence, political instability, a revolving door of prime ministers, scandals that dominated headlines for years. Starmer's message was blunt. The opposition had no moral authority to lecture anyone about stability. He didn't just defend himself, he attacked their credibility. In one move, he reframed the debate. This wasn't about a few staff issues, he argued. This was about the long-term failures of the party now criticising him. And for a moment, the chamber fell into that familiar rhythm. Cheers from one side, groans from the other. But outside Westminster, the reaction was very different. For many viewers, the exchange felt less like a serious political debate and more like a scripted performance. Two parties trading rehearsed lines, each accusing the other of failures, while deeper frustrations went unaddressed. The same arguments, the same blame games, the same political theatre. And that sense of repetition is exactly what the commentator behind the video seized upon. Because to him, this wasn't just another PMQ session. It was proof of something bigger, a system where both major parties talk about change, but rarely deliver it. A parliament where debates feel more like staged confrontations than genuine attempts to solve problems. And as the shouting echoed across the chamber, one uncomfortable question began to form. What if the real problem isn't just the government, but the entire political cycle itself? The more the debate unfolded, the more it began to feel familiar, not in the sense of tradition or democratic routine, but in the sense of repetition, the same arguments, the same talking points, the same carefully crafted attacks, followed by equally rehearsed defences. Across the dispatch box, Kemi Badenoch pressed her case, insisting that the controversies around the Prime Minister's staff weren't just small missteps. To her, they were warning signs, symptoms of a leadership team already showing cracks. She argued that the country had been promised competence and stability. That after years of political chaos, the public was told a new era of professionalism had arrived. But instead, she suggested, the headlines were starting to look all too familiar. Resignations, internal tensions, questions about judgment at the very top. Her message was clear. If this was supposed to be the government of stability, why did it already look so fragile? When Keir Starmer stood to reply, he didn't just defend his record. He went straight back on the offensive. He reminded the chamber of the instability that had defined recent Conservative governments. Multiple leadership changes, economic shocks and scandals that dominated national headlines. His argument was simple. The opposition had spent years presiding over chaos, and now they were trying to lecture others about order. It was a classic political counterattack. Instead of answering every accusation directly, Starmer shifted the focus back onto his opponent's past failures. In doing so, he transformed the debate into something bigger than staff resignations. He turned it into a question of credibility. Who had the right to talk about stability? Who had actually delivered it? And who had spent years undermining it? Inside the chamber, the exchanges followed the familiar script. Cheers, jeers, and the constant roar of partisan applause. But outside Westminster, the reaction was far less enthusiastic. For many viewers, the entire spectacle felt disconnected from reality. Instead of solutions, they saw point scoring. Instead of accountability, they saw deflection. Instead of leadership, they saw performance. And that was exactly the point the commentator driving the video wanted to make. To him, this wasn't just about Starmer or Badenoch. It wasn't even about one party versus another. It was about a political system that seemed locked into the same cycle, year after year. One party makes promises. It gains power. Controversies emerge. The opposition attacks. Then, eventually, the roles reverse. And through it all, the public is left watching the same arguments play out again and again. The video's tone wasn't just critical, it was deeply disillusioned. It suggested that Prime Minister's questions, once intended as a tool of accountability, had become more like political theatre. A weekly performance where both sides delivered lines designed more for headlines than for real answers. And in that environment, the commentator argued, true accountability becomes almost impossible. Because if both sides are constantly blaming each other, who is actually taking responsibility? If every failure is explained away by pointing to the last government, when does real change ever begin? By the end of the exchange, the debate no longer felt like it was about staff resignations or parliamentary tactics. It felt like something bigger was at stake. Public trust, political credibility, and the growing sense that the traditional two-party system might be running out of answers. Because when voters start to feel that every debate sounds the same, every promise feels recycled, and every government ends up facing the same criticisms, that's when the real danger begins. Not for one party, but for the entire political establishment. By the time the Prime Minister's questions session drew to a close, the noise inside the chamber had faded, but the frustration outside it was only growing louder. Because for many viewers, the exchange between Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch didn't feel like a clash of ideas. It felt like a routine. One side attacks, the other side deflects. Both claim the moral high ground. And nothing really changes. That was the central message behind the commentary. According to the narrator, what people had just watched wasn't a moment of real accountability. It was a carefully choreographed performance, one that plays out week after week in the same chamber, with different faces but the same script. And the more it happens, the more disconnected the public begins to feel. The argument wasn't that one party was entirely right and the other entirely wrong. It was that both had, in their own ways, contributed to a growing sense of political fatigue across the country. Conservatives, the narrator claimed, had spent years in power promising stability and competence, only to leave behind economic shocks, leadership turmoil, and a public increasingly frustrated with the direction of the country. Labour, now in power, promised a clean break from that era, a new tone, a new style of leadership, a government built on professionalism and trust. But the early controversies around staff and appointments were already starting to chip away at that promise. And that, the commentator argued, was the real issue. Not just the specific scandals, not just the arguments in Parliament, but the pattern. A cycle where each new government promises change and eventually ends up facing the same criticisms as the one before it. From that perspective, the exchange in Westminster wasn't a turning point. It was a symptom, a sign of a political system that many voters feel no longer represents real change, just alternating management of the same problems. And that's where the video's message became more direct. It shifted from commentary to a call to action. The narrator argued that meaningful change wouldn't come from switching between the same two major parties. That as long as voters continued supporting the traditional political establishment, the cycle would continue. New promises, new slogans, same outcomes. According to that view, the only way to truly disrupt the system would be for the electorate to break away from the old patterns entirely, to stop voting out of habit, to stop choosing what feels like the lesser of two evils, and to start demanding something genuinely different. Whether people agree with that message or not, it reflects a growing sentiment in modern politics, not just in Britain, but across many democracies, a frustration with establishment parties, a desire for alternatives, and a sense that traditional politics no longer delivers the change it promises. And moments like this PMQ's exchange only amplify that feeling. Because when voters watch two leaders clash in Parliament and come away feeling that nothing has really been resolved, it reinforces the idea that the system itself may be part of the problem. So the real question isn't just who won that exchange in Westminster. It's what happens next. Will voters continue choosing between the same familiar options? Or will frustration with the political cycle push them towards something entirely new? Because if that shift ever comes, it won't start in Parliament. It will start at the ballot box. If you found this breakdown useful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Britain Daily. Thanks for watching.